Well, a front-runner to win the Liberal nomination for Julie Bishop's seat of Curtin once said she was not a Liberal voter and that she didn't like the former Foreign Minister herself. Actually, a scroll through her social media also reveals she was definitely no fan of Tony Abbott, a wet rag apparently, and thought it was disgusting when he became Minister for Women's Affairs. Interesting for the political commentators out there, of course, but it does beg the question, should people be judged on stuff they wrote on social media years ago? Scott Phillips from the Motley Fool and Aleks Vickovich, editor of yourmoney.com.au, join me for Taking Stock, where we are. This is our starting point, of course, tonight, guys. Welcome, Scott. Aleks,
okay. What
do you reckon, Aleks, you're the social media guy? Should we be held to every single thing that was written on social media as far back as our social media feeds go?
Well, I suppose the journo in me says yes. You know, it's a legitimate news story that people should be held account, particularly if they're putting up their hands to be in public life. But I think what matters more here is really the pub test still applies, particularly when it comes to social media. So in this case, in the seat of Curtin, you know, I don't think calling Tony Abbott a wet rag in the current climate is going to hurt you. You know, I think if anything, having a go at an establishment politician probably, you know, aids credibility and sort of musters support regardless of the politics. Now, it may hurt you if you're trying to seek pre-selection for a political party, but that's the problem, right? Is that, you know, we only are getting people coming through the ranks who are brown noses or who are party loyalists, and you know, I think the movement is toward independence, and the parties, I think, should reflect that. So I think having a go and saying you're not a dyed-in-the-wool supporter of one party, well, I don't think that many Australians are.
Good point. Scott?
I think, like I said, look, I think there's a couple of things. I think I agree in terms of being accountable for what you've done, but also being given the flexibility and the right to change your mind, to actually move on from a position. God knows what I was saying 10 years ago to amongst friends in the pub.
I think that's where a lot of us feel uncomfortable. It's like, 10 years ago, you're not the same person.
You're entitled to move on, you're entitled to change your views, you're entitled to act upon even to not like Tony Abbott, right? Those things can be reasonable, you can change your view on those. Also, to some degree, it's kind of nice to not have, to Alex's point, this tribalism in politics, right? We're being dragged so far to the extremes of politics. My team versus my country, my team versus the issues. Try and find a dyed-in-the-wool of any party, supporter or parliamentarian, to actually say, you know, my party's wrong in this one thing. It seems impossible for anyone to admit these days because you've got to support the team line so dramatically. And we've seen that, some of the backflips and contortions the poll is doing, trying to desperately
we're so fed up with it, aren't we?
Well, that's the thing. People don't, you know, there's so, to Alex's point about independence, that's exactly why we're looking at the groups and going, I don't need more partisan, I don't need more party hacks. I'd like someone who actually had some substance, something to them, and say, hey, here's what I think. The party thinks this. I don't agree, but I'm in part of the party, I'll go with it. Or I'll argue my case in the parliament, but if it comes to it, you know, we're part of a party. I think we're all mature enough adults to do that. It's just the barracking, the kind of partisanship that's really driving people nuts.
So many of these issues I reckon we have with politicians goes to this kind of one thing, which is authenticity. So does this reveal she's been, you know, not authentic about, you know, what she's putting up when she's now becoming a candidate?
Look, it is a
question we ask
slope, isn't it?
Scott Morrison a lot,
we have this kind of outrage culture where, you know, they can't say anything too controversial, but of course we criticise them all the time for sticking to the script. And I think Scott makes a really good point, and this is not just politics. I mean, this is true in business and in wider society. I think now people are documenting their views at different timestamps throughout their lives, and Scott's right, people do change their views. I mean, I've written opinion pieces just 2 years ago that I probably don't agree with on some topics, right, because the evidence changes and people's perspective changes.
And, you know, a really good example, Kevin Hart stepping down as host of the Oscars because of a previous homophobic tweet, which I think was about 10 years
That's right.
earlier.
And the culture's changed, and you know, arguably these things are never okay, but, you know, people's perspectives change as culture does. I think the problem is, though, a lot of the time with these public figures, they don't do that. They don't say, I made a mistake and I've changed my mind and this is why. They either say, I never did it, and then they get exposed, or they sort of, you know, they just sort of barricade, or, you know, a lot of the time I think they're poorly advised. Ironically, I think this is actually a bigger problem, not for people in public life who we expect controversy from, and in some ways we, you know, we really want it from them. I think it's more of a problem for regular folks who are trying to get jobs in the, you know, current credit climate, trying to get home loans, and are out there sort of, you know, saying all sorts of wild things on social media.
God knows what the banks pick up from our Twitter and our Facebook feeds about spending habits.
Agents, right?
Do they do that? Do they go through? They should probably go through social media.
Real estate agents do, and they look for tenants. They look for your Instagram, your Facebook, your Twitter, see what you talk about, what you're doing, what you're playing, what you're up to. When you've got to make a judgment
wild parties you like going to or hosting.
Who's a good risk, who's not? That's what they do. And at some level, that's not unreasonable on one level. If we're going to be kind of moving into a more open privacy-less world, then fair enough. On the other hand, I'm hoping that over time, as millennials and kind of the generations to come grow up with this stuff, they realise over time this is actually, none of us are perfect. We've all got foibles, we made mistakes, and that's kind of part of who we are. We hold politicians and public figures up to this unrealistic standard that none of us, none of our friends actually adhere to, but somehow we expect them to be whiter than white and holier than thou, and then we wonder why they fall down. It's kind of like, well, you know, the old biblical here without seeing the cast.
I also think we're learning to be less giving of ourselves online in terms of, I think a few years ago I would have put more, you know, for example, Twitter, I would have put more personal views, but, you know, there's just a pile on, you know, forget about it, and people come back and attack you for stuff that you said 2 years ago. So in the end, I reckon you just give less of yourselves online, whether it's Facebook or
Yeah, but I think, you know, there is this generational divide where you've still got, you know, the sort of leaders, the business leaders and political leaders who are out there saying, you know, I smoked but didn't inhale, and, you know, that wasn't too long ago. But then you've got the kids who, you know, are really exposed on this stuff, and, you know, maybe at some stage they just have a moratorium and everyone's in the same boat for that generation and they just draw a line under it and say Facebook's off, it's out of bounds.
Well, as some millennial kind of age people say to me, oh, it's all out there, everyone knows everything, so what can you do about it? I mean, I've heard that view a lot as well.
Don't deny it, I think that's the first thing.
Yes, good point. Now, former Uniqlo employees have described a toxic bullying culture that they've endured, with one employee making very big headlines saying everyone has some form of PTSD as a result of working at the Japanese fast fashion giant. 7 shirts folded per minute, shouting rooms, 18-hour days, all some of the anecdotal evidence that have been given to the, I guess it was given to the media. There's been some kind of court case involved as well, though. It's gotten big headlines, and I see it's been retweeted in all parts of the world, guys, because it is in 21 countries, some 45,000 employees, or roughly on last figures. What do you think? This is a view of 4 employees in this article. Is that enough to make it a story? What do we think?
Look, I think potentially, like, it's enough to make it a story because the topic of mental health is trending so heavily, and, you know, rightly so. I think a lot of advocates have spent a lot of time trying to make this topic of workplace culture, bullying, mental health, you know, wellness. They've tried to make that front page, and that is starting to happen. So I think it's a legitimate story from that perspective. But, you know, in this instance, there's also a lot of commentary on social media, you know, taking the mickey out of this and saying 7 shirts in 1 minute is pretty impressive, and, you know, maybe this is the Marie Kondo influence, you know, entering the workforce. But, you know, I think there is a more serious point here around workplace relations and so on. And I think, you know, given all that, Uniqlo's probably got, you know, more of a PR issue on their hands that mitigates the productivity they might have gained from, you know, overworking these kids.
True.
Yeah. Companies that big, Warren Buffett said about Berkshire Hathaway, at some point somewhere in the Berkshire Hathaway empire with 200,000 odd employees, someone's doing something wrong right now. And so if you start with that position of like one example, so 4 employees, 1 store, is that genuinely representative of the whole thing? And I think to some degree we can be guilty of a bit of pile-on, right? Someone puts a tweet out, big name, sensationalist kind of claims, hey, what if that was real? It's almost that reporting by social media, right? Twitter a user on Twitter says, and that becomes the story. I think there's some element of us need to take a step back and saying, is that justified by enough evidence across a chain, across the common experience? I will say too, and I don't know this particular circumstance, I certainly haven't seen any medical paperwork on it. We need to be a little bit careful too. The bullying is real. When you start throwing around terms like PTSD, I think we've got to be a little bit careful here that we don't sensationalise and almost kind of bring that down a level. If they have, fair enough, take it and we'll move forward. But if this is just kind of, if PTSD becomes a byword for I'm a bit unhappy, then we start to actually lose the fight. To Alex's point of mental health is really important. If we're raising legitimate cases with legitimate diagnoses and concerns, more power to them. If it's become a byword for I'm not very happy and I went home, had a bit of a cry, that's a problem if it's bullying, so absolute problem. But we need to be a little bit careful, a bit like anxiety, right? Everyone's anxious, but then that's not clinical anxiety. We've got to be a little bit careful at how we treat mental health, that we do allocate it properly and say, these are real issues, let's not trivialise them, if that is the case. And again, I'm not saying it is, but if it is the case, the overuse of those terms does tend to just makes them trivial, and that stops the real issues and the real messages getting through.
And whether you think some of those issues that are raised are overstated because it's a few employees, whether you think that or not, I think one thing that came out for me was the company had obviously very quickly tried to respond to some of the things that it said, because one of the things was about boxes being piled sky high in some of the rooms, falling on people, and they said as soon as we heard that, we jumped on it. The fact that they've got this very negative PR was an instance for them to obviously look at a few practices internally. So that's been overall a very positive thing for them, in terms of actually fixing some of those issues, which are probably quite real in terms of what they're being raised.
Yeah, I dare say there's a few phone calls being made from Tokyo right now, and it's it's gotten them involved. I think to Scott's point, that is really important that we draw that distinction. At the same time, for media, that's really, really tough to sort of set a yardstick and say, this is textbook PTSD and this isn't, and your claim is therefore not that. So, I do think that it's an important thing to do, and perhaps we've got to rely on the medical experts a bit more.
Yep. All right. Well, a Harvard professor has concluded you really can buy happiness. A researcher of time-money trade-offs says we should all be spending our money outsourcing things like household chores or paying to live closer to work in order to buy happier time for ourselves. Scott and Aleks, it seems like a perk for the well-off, but I was interested in the fact that he found people on the lowest incomes were the ones who actually benefited the most because they were so time poor. If they could allocate any money to freeing up their time, they were a lot happier. So it was an interesting read. What do you reckon?
Look, by happier time, it reminds me of Donald Trump's executive time, right? You're kind of buying that chunk of time. You don't have to be responsible for anything, right? It's executive time. It's happier time. It's,
chairman's hours.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, it's my special place.
We should all have a few more chairman's hours in our lives.
That's right, exactly. After the show, I think it's the old thing about what you do with the time that you buy back. We know that money doesn't... the things you buy don't make you happy, but the experiences you have give you that opportunity. So it's kind of what you replace that time with, right? It's one thing people say, well, my time's worth X dollars an hour, that's what I work for. So if I'm paying that for a cleaner, that I'm making my money back. It's like, well, if you're doing it the weekend, you weren't really working that hour anyway. So that hour wasn't worth that much. It's more what you do with that time. Do you make of it something useful, or are you just going to spend it scrolling through social media, in which case, maybe save a couple of bucks and go and do the job. On the flip side, there's a real mental kind of emotional benefit to getting some of that stuff just out of the way. It's done. You don't have to do it. It takes a bit of stress and just grief out of your life. And we kind of deserve a little bit of if you can afford it, hour or two back you get when someone does the cleaning or something else, it's kind of worth it, right?
Yeah, look, I'm all for this. I'm still grieving for when my younger siblings went and got real jobs and sort of graduated to the workforce, and I wasn't able to offload my household admin onto them, legally, or I don't know, Fair Work Australia might be onto me now for internal family dynamics. But I think as well, if you look at the share economy, I think the other end of this, the recipients of the work, is also valid to look at. I mean, I think we have a knee-jerk tendency to think of this sort of work as exploitation or not being work of dignity, but I don't think that's the case. And I think if you look at things like Airtasker, you're going to get a lot more people from different walks of life putting up their hand to do this sort of work, and I think that can create economic opportunties anywhere. I mean, one example
is... We just spoke with the founder of the Jim's franchise. Jim's mowing, Jim's pet grooming, Jim's personal training, Jim's everywhere. People have made successful businesses out of all of this.
And I think we assume that therefore somebody who's working as a handyman or as a cleaner is doing that 100 hours a day on low pay, but a lot of creative industries are benefiting from this. I was in LA recently and spoke to an Uber driver who was telling me that actors have been able to go to auditions for months longer or years longer than they used to. They don't have to sell out and go get a 9-to-5 anymore because they can supplement that sort of creative work with Uber. And I think this is just part of the share economy.
All right. Well, the final word goes to the Harvard professor who said, with every dollar you spend, you must be thinking, is this money changing the way I spend my time? So we'll think about that. Thank you so much, Aleks and Scott. Great to have you on for Taking Stock.